This week begins a series of 10 lectures on aspects of American history that are interesting to me. They are idiosyncratically chosen, and, well, I should say it's not entirely coincidental. The topics are not just random. I tended to focus on areas that most seemed to tick people off when my book came out, and I want to rub salt in the wound by expanding on them, going into much greater detail on subjects that what I find sort of funny is that a lot of my critics seem to know basically nothing about. So I want to really drive them crazy, talking about things like nullification that you're not supposed to talk about. A wonderful experience for me a couple weeks ago was I was speaking at a conference that was taking place inside one of the House office buildings in Washington, D.C. And I got up there and gave a talk on nullification and the principles of 1798. And for those of you who don't know what that is, by the time we get to the end of today and you know what it is, you'll understand what a glorious moment for me that was, to be able to stand up there and say things that were so subversive and yet at the same time so characteristically American. I mean, there's the old America right there of Thomas Jefferson. All right, well, I'm going to start right in then talking about the title of this first talk is Thomas Jefferson and the Principles of 98. What does that mean? Well, as we go along, you may think that, I don't mean to be insulting your intelligence if I read to you the supremacy clause of the Constitution or explain what it is. I realize that we have a diverse audience. We have people from other countries. We have the webcast all over the place. I don't want to take anything for granted. And in my own background, where I teach, I've got people who would succeed at any college and are very highly skilled, and I have people who are, let's just say, aren't so skilled. And I've sort of been able to formulate a style that is able to appeal to them all and to explain things to them all. And I will be stopping for questions at the end, and feel free to ask anything you like. And you shouldn't think, well, if I ask this question, then he'll think I wasn't listening, or this is a silly question. I'm telling you, I've heard all the silly questions. There really aren't any silly questions, because you should, if you have the question, then probably somebody else in the room has it. And it could actually just be that I left something out or I was unclear on something. It's totally legitimate. And in addition to that, one of the things after you've taught for a number of years that you learn is how to make even a not the best question in the world sound like an intelligent question. So somebody asks, kind of an odd question. You have this skill of turning it around and making it sound like a brilliant question. The only time I was stumped on that was when I was asking students, could they list for me one of the rights protected in the Bill of Rights. I said the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So can you just give me an example of one? And I kid you not, the student said, "Thou shalt not kill." So I thought, all right, the poor kid's thinking of the 10 Commandments, and I'm trying to say 10 amendments as clearly as possible. And this one, I didn't see how I could turn around, so I just pretended I didn't hear that. But then he continues shouting out other commands, have no false gods. And I thought, there's really nothing I can do. So if I say, hey, look over there, and I run away, that's a sign that it was a bad question. All right. Anyway, let's get started with the year 1798, which is such a critical year in American history because very, very important documents are drafted in that year. And you can tell that they are central and important documents, that they are documents in the service of liberty. They are documents that the powers that be very much detest. You can tell that because on the 200th anniversary of their drafting, no government agency commemorated them. Absolute silence in 1998, and it's no surprise. In the late 1790s, diplomatic relations between the United States and France reached really a low point. They had been deteriorating for several years, and by the later 1790s, what developed was what has come to be known among students of American history as the quasi-war with France. Quasi-war because it's not a full-fledged declared war on the part of either party. It does not involve a massive invasion of one country or the other. It is, in effect, a series of naval clashes in which both sides are engaging each other on the seas, and the French are, in some cases, seizing American shipping. and so on. That's, in effect, the nature of the quasi-war with France. It is by no means a total war, but it was enough of the United States was on enough of a war footing that President John Adams would go out in public, oftentimes, with a sword at his side to indicate to people that we're on a sort of quasi-war. I don't know what he would have had in a full-fledged war, but a quasi-war apparently equals a sword. I don't know if he's expecting to run into a Frenchman, but there you have it. So this is going on, and the significance of this is some legislation that's passed in 1798, passed by the Congress and apparently reluctantly signed by John Adams, called the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Now these acts, to make a long story short, do some things along these lines. The Alien Acts, for example, one of the features of that, all this is explained in my chapter 4, at least this part of what I'm saying. But among other things, the Alien Act had the function of basically going after aliens in the country who were in some way disloyal, or whose political allegiances were not so clear. The idea being that during wartime you have to put more controls on people's liberty. I mean, we've all heard this argument many times. And there was a concern that this had a partisan motivation, that it was actually aimed at Albert Gallatin, who was a Swiss-born, important Pennsylvania Republican, who later became Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson. So this would possibly be used in a partisan way. Let's recall that there was a party known as the Federalist Party, to which President John Adams belonged, to which George Washington had belonged and associated with, and there were the Republicans of Thomas Jefferson, not the Republicans of today, of course, but the Republicans of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the like. And there was a concern on the part of the Republicans that the Alien and Sedition Acts were really just a grandiose rationalization for criminalizing political opposition and tossing Republicans in jail, and particularly the Sedition Act, because the Sedition Act in effect criminalizes excessive criticism of the federal government. That if you do something that tends to bring the federal government into contempt or disrepute, then you could be brought up on charges, you could be fined, you could be tossed in jail. And there was concern that this could be used, again, as a means for the Federalists simply to suppress the Republicans. And it did happen in some cases. There were at least a couple of dozen people imprisoned over this, and Republican newspaper editors. And, of course, these newspaper editors believed they were engaging in the normal exercise of the freedom of the press, but they were told that, no, in fact, you have crossed the boundary into seditious speech. Now, Jefferson himself was, of course, Thomas Jefferson was the vice president at the time. And this is part of the beauty of the original constitutional structure, was that whoever got the most votes in the presidential election was elected the president, and whoever got the second most votes was elected the vice president. So this sometimes meant that you had, sort of like you had sort of like the odd couple, because you got two different guys in there, and they weren't running together as a ticket or whatever. Sometimes they have got totally different governing philosophies. So that's Thomas Jefferson's position. He's in there with John Adams. He's a Republican. Adams is a Federalist. Jefferson's very concerned about this legislation, and yet it's his own president has signed it. So he's in a bit of an awkward spot, in that it would be a bit unseemly for him to go out on the offensive against it, seeing that he belongs to the very executive branch whose task it is to enforce these laws. Well, Jefferson feared the partisan nature of the legislation, certainly, as one of his concerns, that his party would be criminalized in effect. There's also some complaining between Jefferson and Madison in their correspondence with each other that somebody is opening their mail. So this is quite serious that this is taking place. There was a case of a gentleman who said, and I don't know about how the FCC will feel about this, so I'll change the bad word. There was one gentleman who said, I hope that the presidential saluting cannon hits President Adams in the, we'll say, behind.